Hello, my name is Dr. Michael Glass. I'm the Regional Studies Association's Territorial Chair for the United States. The Regional Studies Association is a learned society concerned with the analysis of regions and regional issues. Through our international membership, we provide an authoritative voice of and a network for students, academics, practitioners, and policymakers. You can find out more about the Regional Studies Association, including information on membership, funding opportunities, and events at regionalstudies.org. I'm pleased to present a new installment of our Regionalists on Film series that introduces you to the work of established and emerging regional scholars and their scholarship. Today, it's my special privilege to introduce Dayne Walling. Dayne is a community development consultant and doctoral candidate in geography at the University of Minnesota. He's now an adjunct faculty in geography at Saginaw Valley State University and Central Michigan University. Dayne was a Rhodes and Truman Scholar, an Aspen Rodell Fellow, and an AmeriCorps alum. Dayne's research interests include urban redevelopment, the politics of scale, planning and infrastructure, public policy analysis, and Midwestern cities. He's got 20 years of professional experience as a public executive, nonprofit administrator, social entrepreneur, research fellow, and instructor. He previously served 2 terms as the mayor of his hometown, Flint, Michigan. And under his leadership, the city of Flint adopted the Imagine Flint comprehensive master plan to develop collaborative initiatives in public safety, infrastructure development, and volunteerism to address the deep challenges of a deindustrialized city and the water crisis. Dayne, welcome. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thank you for having me on and giving me a chance to talk about some of these things that are important in my work and life. I'm coming to you right from my basement study here in Flint, Michigan. So glad we can have this conversation.
And I can see Flint looming over your shoulder, so I'm sure we'll be talking about that in a little bit as well. But perhaps first we could talk about what got you interested in researching regions and regional development.
Yeah, for me, it really did start with cities. So I'm a Flint native, grew up here, was in Flint public schools, and really experienced, without understanding what was happening, experienced a deindustrialized city in the 1970s and 80s, and even into the 90s with factory closings and just everything that does to a community. And as I went into my college career and professional career, I carried with me these questions about, why did this happen? How did it happen exactly the way it did? Why my hometown? Why not other places? So I really thought a lot about Flint and Flint's, changing position in this global economy. So when I got to graduate school and started working on my PhD at the University of Minnesota, where I'm now back enrolled, hoping to finish, I started coming across, the scholarship on how cities and regions relate with each other, and places where cities and regions have been more collaborative, places where there have been more combative, which frankly was more my experience in Flint, and I think has been more common in the state of Michigan and in much of the Midwest. So I really started to want to understand, well, why are those differences there? Why does a Detroit metro region become so kind of fractured and combative, and then a different metro region, like where I was going to graduate school in Minneapolis and St. Paul, have a council of governments where counties are actually sharing, tax revenue. So the Mall of America is helping to fund, police officers in the city of Minneapolis. Like, how did those different distinctions come to be? So that's going back to some of these early questions that I've now carried with me: cities and regions and inequalities and the differences between regions and places within regions. My journey really did start with cities, but I'm just still seeing the important ways that regions are a part of shaping what's happening, even in central and inner cities.
The narrative of your story to this point as a doctoral candidate at Minnesota in geography also takes in that lengthy experience in public service. Can you say a little bit more about how you feel those things come together in addressing the regional questions that you were just mentioning?
Well, I'm somebody who's always been interested in politics, whether it's neighborhood politics or church politics or city politics, of course, where I had the opportunity to serve. So as I'm looking at these questions that I was mentioning about cities and regions and decisions that are being made about taxes and transportation, I've come to kind of see how those political decisions and institutions are, both affecting regions and being affected by regions and their context. And that's really where I've tried to focus my doctoral work and my current research, is understanding those institutional differences and those governance dynamics. How are the fates of people in in my case kind of Flint and the neighboring city of Grand Blanc in the county of Genesee, how are they affected by shared institutions? In what ways are their economic development entities working together, or frankly working sometimes in opposition to each other? So my experience, having served as mayor in Flint, when I didn't have an academic hat on, I wasn't a researcher, but I was constantly taking notes. I'm paying attention to these dynamics, and I got a real inside look at how even federal and state policies were being implemented at the local, at the county, at the metropolitan or regional scale, and really seeing how critical those were, not just in sort of general, but how are different organizations governed? Who sits on the board? Does the board vote equally among all 11 members, or do some members have privileges because they're the central city, or because they're not the central city in some cases? So yeah, I'm now trying to process all of that. I'm thinking back on my own experience, boards I served on, policy making committees that I was a member of, and I'm trying to really view it with an analytical lens, and now compare that to what I see occurring in other cities that have experienced deindustrialization. Some that, like Flint, frankly, haven't done particularly well. And then also some others that we've probably forgotten went through significant deindustrialization, maybe like a Charlotte metropolitan area, because in so many ways it's actually doing pretty well now. So those differences are kind of driving the big questions that I'm trying to look at. And I really know from personal experience the difference that policies and governance, who has power relative to other people, who doesn't have as much power. Those are the questions that I'm using the regional frame to try to get at and understand.
And you've done that recently in some work that's been comparing different post-industrial cities, thinking about their water governance and thinking about how deindustrialization has really influenced of that water system governance. I'm thinking there of your recent paper looking at Providence and Scranton. What does regional governance offer, or are there any solutions to the sorts of inequalities that those cities face that can come from thinking regionally?
Yeah, well, of course, in Flint, we've had to focus on our water infrastructure system, this tragic set of circumstances and decisions that were made largely by state emergency managers. that have had us paying attention now to, our water system and quality here. So that got me questioning what's been the experience in other places with water governance. How has the changing position of the central city in the global economy, in deindustrialized regions, how has that changed? How have different water systems adapted to those pressures? And Scranton and Providence represented two really interesting and different examples. So the Scranton drinking water supply system today is entirely privatized. And what that means under Pennsylvania law is that there's effectively no longer any local governance of that system. The private utility operator is accountable to the state's public utility system. So then that, for me, of course, raises questions about, who's now deciding when rates get increased? Who's really paying attention to treatment and distribution and capital investments? And by it being a state public utility, you won't be surprised to hear that Scranton doesn't have a direct voice in that process. It's a public body, but there's really no longer any kind of local control. And that leads, I think, to some interesting implications. With Providence, the municipal water system actually has become a regional service provider. And you could in some ways say, well, all right, well, that really positions Providence as a central player in this regional work. But as I dug into the documentation and looked at the regulatory framework, what I found was, again, the state was putting some pretty significant demands on that central city, now regional water system, for providing water to some growing suburban areas that are in some ways probably competing and drawing away from the prosperity that a central city like Providence is trying to achieve. So this recent work has really opened my eyes to some further questions that I want to ask. How does privatization play into this equation? How does state policy play into this equation? Because so much of what I'm kind of looking at is not what it seems on the surface. And that was, tragically, again, part of our experience here in Flint. It takes a great deal of examination and assessment to really get at what, but how these regional dynamics are playing out in terms of who benefits and who's paying the price.
Now, I'm aware that for some watching this, they may have heard something about the Flint story, but may not be familiar with some of the contours of it. Would you like to share a little bit more detail about your own city's history about the water crisis that occurred there?
Well, I will, and I'll be brief. And there's plenty of good commissions and reports that have been done about this. While I was in office for my second term, the city was under the control of state emergency managers who were appointed by the governor. Flint's a place that's for a long time struggled with financial management given our declining tax base. And I may be biased, but I feel like we worked really hard to try to address some of those challenges, but still, weren't going to get to the level of stability that the state government, Governor Rick Snyder in particular, was demanding of municipalities and school districts in Michigan at the time. This was post-recession, 2012, 2013, 2014. We had more than a dozen municipalities and school districts across the state under emergency management. And one of the decisions that got made was for the city to change water sources. And something we're still learning about now is how decisions kind of weren't properly made with water treatment. So, while myself and other local officials were being told that the water was meeting, drinking water standards and was safe, in reality, there was treatment not occurring to protect our community from lead and from legionnaires and other potential threats. So, I lost what would have been my second reelection as that crisis was coming to light. I think many people watching this may not be surprised at that political outcome. I certainly understood the community's frustration, and they're just, for me as a candidate, it wasn't quite time to answer all those questions and really make my record clear of what I had tried to do, and planning and capital investments and advocating for the community. So that work has continued. We did finally get strong federal and state support for lead service line replacement, for other infrastructure. We became something of a model, and I think the way our community really fought for justice became an inspiration for some of the state and federal policy changes. So we now have some of the strictest drinking water standards in the country in Michigan, and our experience, I think, inspired some of what you'll find in the federal bipartisan infrastructure package, where the funding for probably removal of half of the country's lead service lines has been appropriated by Congress. And if states and local governments step up and match those dollars, then it's not inconceivable that you and I will see a day when there's no one in the country drinking from a lead service line, and that would be a real achievement. So Flint's story is really linked to these debates that are continuing to take place at the state and federal level. And just to kind of bring it back to regions for a minute, I really think that, not just here, but these other regions that I'm looking at across the Midwest and the near South and the Northeast, and frankly, some of the older industrial communities in the West that I haven't gotten to yet in my own work, we have a lot of work to do, but that regional scale can be one of the places where I think we have the most impact, where we can very efficiently address these problems, where we can cooperate in really positive and equitable ways. And I'm hoping that my work and lessons from time in office will help point some of those directions forward.
That really gets to my last question, and you've answered it to some degree about what your take is about the state of regional scholarship at large, and what it provides, what the opportunities are, and what perhaps some of the challenges are for regional scholars working within the United States at this point in time.
Yeah, and I think in the US, one thing there's so much work happening in other parts of the world that we can be inspired and motivated by. The level of regional analysis and the sophistication of that takes place in much of Europe and parts of Africa, certainly China and Southeast Asia. So this is a place where I think in the US, we should be running, fast to try to play some catch up, because regions are such an integral part, for better and worse, of the global economy. They're a scale at which corporations are operating. They're a scale that ecological and environmental impacts can be assessed and in many cases addressed when you think about watersheds and ecological systems, how those relate to our food, our water, our energy systems. And even when it comes to the nuts and bolts of politics and policy making that I've been so close to, the regional scale, I think, is a place where one can really see the effects of federal and state policies in the US context. And it's also a scale where it's not unreasonable to think we can make some impact, that someone serving on a local planning commission could have a very significant regional impact. Someone like yourself, and I know your work does this, within a university setting, you can have impact in the greater Pittsburgh area. So I think giving more attention to that regional scale really opens up a lot of opportunities. So I'm very, interested in the research that's coming out. I think we do have a revival of interest in the U.S. underway, thinking about institutions and networks and politics and these, we're talking about water systems and sustainability and climate change. All of those are really effectively addressed from a policy perspective, from a research perspective, at the regional level. So I'm excited about what hopefully is to come in some future years, and look forward to being a part of those discussions and debates.
Well, on that positive note, that's all the time we have today to talk with Dayne, but thanks so much for joining me today to talk about your perspective on regional studies and regional scholarship. I'd like to encourage all of you watching to learn more about regional studies and the Regional Studies Association's work at regionalstudies.org. Dayne, would you care to have the last word today?
Well, look, I think we've covered so much. Thank you for allowing me to talk about my experience and continue to shed light on some of the challenges we have in our Flint community, and just how those lessons and hopefully my work will help contribute to more sustainable, more equitable, places. I think that's plenty of work in front of all of us. So thank you for what you're doing to lead us down that path.
A laudable goal too. Thank you so much, Dayne. Have a great day.
Okay, thank you.